This is the God, Man and Markets podcast, conversations on faith, culture and the economy. Hello there, my name is David Clayton. I am here with two friends of mine. One is Father Brad Elliott, a Dominican priest, currently based in Washington, D.C., but from the, what do you call it, the
Western Dominican province.
The Western Dominican province.
Yeah.
So I know him from California here. And then also Dr. MIchel Accad, who is my doctor and a member of my church. And if you've followed any of the podcasts that I've done on the Way of Beauty, you'll have seen his name mentioned. So we are here today to discuss a book that was suggested by MIchel. And so I'm going to let him talk about this first. It's by a now deceased priest called Father Ivan Illich, and it's called Shadow Work. If you're watching this, there is the book. And it's a series of essays. And I had not read any of these beforehand, and Father Brad will tell us, but I don't think he had either. So but it's extremely interesting. We're just going to discuss one essay about the institution of the Spanish language through academia, a sort of systematized introduction of the Spanish language in the 16th century and the impact that had on society. Now, that may sound like a strange topic to be interested in, but even Illich makes this relevant to today, I think. And I think this is what MIchel has spotted. So, MIchel, why don't you start? Tell us, first of all, why you're enthusiastic about Illich. Tell us a little bit about him, and then why you suggested this essay. So you just bring us up to speed here
Sure.
With the listeners.
So I'll tell you, historically how I learned about, or how I discovered Ivan Illich. And I first discovered him, I think it must have been 15 years ago, maybe more. I can't remember when, but I discovered him when, by some circumstances, I spotted an article that he had written in the 70s in the Lancet about medicine, about the state of health. It was a critique. It was a scathing critique of the healthcare system. And I thought it was a fantastic essay. And because then, I mean, I knew I was immersed in my studies, and I think in my residency, or perhaps I was already, in my the more advanced phase of my studies. But I was clearly dissatisfied, like many people. But I was trying to understand what's wrong with this healthcare system, and I came across this essay by Ivan Illich written in the 1970s, highly critical of the modern medical system, and I thought, this is great. I bought a whole bunch of books. I went and I realized that he had written not just on medicine, but he had written on a variety of other topics, including education, and he seemed like an interesting social critic to me. And I got the books, and I think I read the one he had written a volume on medicine, and the others stayed on my shelves unread for many, many, many years. And I think at the time it was hard for me to sort of situate Illich, to understand him fully. I was away from the church at that time, so the church was not a big preoccupation of mine. Mm. My worldview in general was very different from what it is now, and so those books languished on my shelves for many years, until I think last year, Charlie, who now has joined us, Charlie Deist is here with us. Charlie sent me an email saying, "Listen, check out this essay by a man named David Cayley on Ivan Illich." And David Cayley wrote an article imagining what Ivan Illich would say in response to our pandemic lockdowns, and the response to the pandemic. And so I read that essay, and I thought it was a terrific essay. There were ideas that David Cayley was relating about Ivan Illich that, once again, I found very compelling regarding medicine and public health and how we deal with all these issues. And I invited David Cayley to come on my medical podcast. I have a medical podcast separately, and we had a great conversation. And in the following that podcast, my interest in Ivan Illich was rekindled, and so I started reading more. David Cayley just published a very important volume, simply called Ivan Illich. I think the subtitle is An Intellectual Journey, and where he explains not only the complex thought of Illich, but his interesting life and so forth. So that can take us in a very long tangent, and I've already been speaking too much. But let me give you maybe in a couple of minutes. Ivan Illich was a priest. He was ordained in the 1950s. He was a very bright person. I mean, evidently recognized within the church as being extremely bright. He spoke many languages. He had come from a kind of you might say, kind of an aristocratic background in the ex Austro-Hungarian Empire. You know, he was born in what is now Croatia, and became a priest in the 1950s. Moved to the U.S. was dispatched to the U.S. to do some work, and in the U.S. became very interested in studying, and that's became his main intellectual theme, is the relationship between or how large institutions in a way corrupt. I think he probably used the term corrupt Christian virtues. And so that's sort of the dominant theme. And not only so, and that applies not only to modern institutions like the healthcare system, the educational system, and many other things that he talks about, but he became very critical of the church itself. And he thought that the church itself had sort of he remained, and he considered himself a priest in good standing, and he was never he never thought that he was advancing heretical ideas, if you will. But certainly from a point where he was very popular and supported within the church, his fortunes within the church changed, and he was asked no longer to speak as a theologian, or in fact his books at the time were put on the list of on the index of I forgot the exact name, the index of forbidden books. In the late 60s, the late 70s, he lost some of the support that he had within the hierarchy of the Vatican, because those people either died or whatnot, and then the new guard was critical of what he was doing, and he voluntarily relinquished the public, his public ministry as a priest. And he said that he would not speak, he would no longer speak, he would no longer minister as a priest, he would no longer speak claiming to represent the church. But he continued to write books, and he wrote books that in the 70s and mostly in the 70s were extremely, extremely popular in the secular world, in the academic secular world. He wrote books that were critical of the educational system, as I mentioned, the healthcare system and whatnot. And apparently he was invited around the world, Germany, England, the US, packed auditoriums on campuses to hear his ideas. And he was it was part of the movement of the 1960s. Right, the revolutionary thoughts and ideas of the 1960s. But you couldn't pigeonhole him. He was clearly not, a hippie or anything like that. He had ideas that were very unusual, but there was a kind of a rebellious and revolutionary fever in his writing about how to reconsider all these, established institutions. And he became very, very popular. But in the secular world itself, he had a change of fortune as well, because he started writing books that all of a sudden went against the grain of what his erstwhile supporters thought was proper. He wrote a book called Gender that irritated a lot of the feminists that up until then were following him, and essentially he was canceled. He was one of maybe the first cancellations, but he continued to write, and he became close friend with David Cayley, who I just mentioned, who eventually wrote the book that was just published. And David Cayley collected interviews by Ivan Illich. He continues to have a small following, although he was much less influential in the 1980s and 1990s. And he eventually died in 2003. But he continued to write books, and as I discover them now, and I don't know him deeply, I find his thoughts and his ideas very provocative, and I'm sort of wrestling with them. And there are many things that I think are extremely important in what he says. I don't always agree with everything, the way he puts it and whatnot, but I think whatever he says is provocative and worth discussing. So that's where I'll stop here.
So I'm just going to summarize what I've heard. Tell me whether I've got this. So you're painting the picture of an original thinker. We need to be careful as we read him. It's not all good, but he definitely has insights which are valuable. And I'm going to suggest, based upon what I've read and what I've heard, that he's grappling with this paradox of between an order that represents the pattern of society and the freedom of the individual, or the human person, and how there seems to be this tension between, shall we say, government and freedom in its various manifestations in society. And that's what he's grappling with, and that's what makes him interesting for me today. So is that fair? Is that
yeah, I think that's right. And I don't think it's just government. I think it's institutions in general. So he's critical of.
Yeah, I'm using sort of government in the sense of
correct.
In the most broad generic term, governing or policy.
That's right. Because I think in many ways, in my view, and we'll have a chance to discuss that. The reason we have very large institutions is because they are helped by government in a way into being large institutions. Right?
Yes.
I mean, that's sort of built in to how our modern societies are organized.
Okay, so now we go from all these sort of modern institutions, and we go to 16th century Spain, and this essay, which you recommended that we read first. So tell us about that.
Right. So I put it in the context. It's part of a book called Shadow Work, which is where he examines the way economists view society. And in this book, he develops an idea and an attraction for what he ends up calling the vernacular, which means, which I would interpret as the spontaneous way that people live together.
Okay.
Right? As opposed to the institutional, or the things that are organized from top down,
yes,
if you will. And so among these essays that address the various aspects of the tension between the vernacular and the institutional is this essay where he relates a historical event at the court of Queen Isabella in Spain in the 1500s, right at the dawn of modernity, right as Columbus is launching his caravels to go discover the new world. There's a man by the name of Nebrija, Elia Antonio Nebrija, who was an intellectual who pleaded or petitioned the Queen to take the grammar of the Castilian language that he had devised and spread it and impose it on the whole of Spain, and to educate the masses, but only to educate the masses, but also to allow the Queen to spread, right? I mean, to use language, to make language a tool of the Spanish monarchy.
Yes, and this goes beyond simply ease of communication. This is about sort of the structure of the language governing thought and behavior, is his argument.
Standardizing, right? I mean, the key point is standardizing as opposed, because you're right, the communication, which was fascinating to me, he points out, Illich points out that at that time, the printing press had been invented already. There were hundreds of things being published in the vernacular, in the various different dialects of Spain and throughout Europe. And people were reading all these things in different languages. And it seemed for, those who are, the more bureaucratic minded, right, in the world, it seemed too chaotic, and there was something that needed to be organized and ordered and dealt with. It was viewed as a problem, whereas Illich views it as a good that has been squashed.
When I was reading
Illich, Father Brad talking,
this is Father Brad. I was reading Illich's description of the few decades right after the invention of the printing press and the proliferation of the new codex, the books that were going all around because of the printing press. It struck me as a parallel to our own time, a few decades after the kind of the proliferation of the internet throughout the world.
Yeah.
And because we are at that same horizon of a brand new mode of communication, which is opening up vistas of information that have never been accessible before to whole communities of people. And we're right on that verge of struggling with these same issues. So right now, the internet is in many ways kind of like what the world of Nebrija was in the 1480s and 1490s, with the explosion of books in a variety of vernacular languages that people finally had access to for the first time in their life. And for, like you said, for the bureaucratically minded, it seemed like a little bit of chaos that had to be tamed.
Right.
Yes, it had to be tamed. And if it's going to be tamed, it needs to have a tamer.
I completely agree with you. I had the same thought. And I'm thinking right now of the Tim Cooks and the Googles of the world pleading to the governments to put order into this chaos and to have the YouTube standard of conversation be passed on. So
well, it was fascinating to me as I was reading Illich's the account of this time, because when the printing press was available to people, and when there was, in a sense, a free market of books, there was that dangerous reality of ideas being spread that were not part of the establishment ideas. That's very dangerous.
Right.
I'm just going to jump in. Charlie, are you with us? I see your picture on the screen there.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so why don't you, this is Charlie Deist, who wasn't here right at the beginning. He's calling in from a sailing ship somewhere in the bay.
Not quite, but close enough.
Or in the harbour somewhere. So you heard most of what MIchel said in our discussion. You're the one who rediscovered Illich, shall we say, for all of us. Just in the light of what we've been saying, why don't you talk about your enthusiasm for Illich and what caught your eye as you read him, and then speak to some of the particulars of this essay as well, if you can.
Yes, thank you. I discovered Illich at a time when I was on the verge of converting to becoming a member of the Catholic Church, converting to Catholicism. And you could say, in a way, that that Illich helped my conversion along, or maybe that I converted in spite of him, because the way that he writes about the Catholic Church, there's definitely a tension in terms of the institution, the human institution, which we all know is flawed. I think he kind of lays bare some of its flaws in a way that makes it a little bit hard if you're sort of standing right on the verge of crossing the Tiber. Then it becomes there's a stark contrast in terms of becoming a non-denominational Christian, as I was at the time, to identifying with an institution that can be blamed for various inquisitions or things that we can point to as being somehow less than living up to the ideals of the gospel. And I think that MIchel did a good job kind of giving the overview, the details of his life and his thought. And there's one thing in particular in sort of summarizing it. I'm just actually getting to the end of David Cayley's book, where he really gets to the core of this idea of kind of the corruption of Christianity being reflected in various institutions, including the modern church. And he talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan, illustrating the idea that Christianity has a certain effect on all of these different worlds. There's, the Jewish people occupied a certain world. And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, you have the Levite who passes the man in the ditch by because he would become ritually unclean according to his world's rules. If he were to do anything to touch that man, he wouldn't be able to perform his religious duties. And the Samaritan likewise is from a certain world. And but the Samaritan helps the man in the ditch in spite of the difference between them, the difference between their worlds. And Christianity, this effect of kind of breaking down the barriers between worlds. The thing is, with Christianity, that cannot become an ethos itself. The parable of the Good Samaritan illustrates something that is sort of beyond. There's no, in a way, I think that it gets to this question of, what is Christian culture? Because in the West, we have an idea of Christian culture, but in a sense, once you institutionalize the gospel as a rule, and you create helping institutions, charitable institutions, you separate the act of giving the charity from the real sort of source of charity, that in the gospel at least. So this is something that I've wrestled with too, before becoming Catholic and as a Catholic. How do we keep that the parable of the Good Samaritan in mind without just leaning on institutions to do some of the heavy lifting? So there's also kind of the libertarian angle where Illich is not really properly considered a libertarian, but I think that he can sharpen a libertarian's instincts and sharpen a libertarian's arguments. And in the same way, I think that as Catholics, we can definitely sharpen our senses by reading Illich and by trying to understand him and his critique of institutions.
Yeah, including the church. I'll just come in here and just give a little bit of my impression of this chapter and the ideas that occurred. First of all, I found the historical account of the introduction of the Spanish language, and he goes on to talk about Caxton in England as well, the sort of standardization of language, and then the parallels he draws to the overall effect of institutions imposing things in a top-down way. And one thing that occurred to me is that this is really the problem we're seeing today, is this yearning for some sort of authority, for elites, for institutions, governments, standards that, as you described it, MIchel, bring order out of this. It's more the fear of chaos than the chaos. And it reminds me, and Father, you're here, so you can redirect me if I'm wrong, but I think of the Israelites saying, we want a king, when in fact God is the king. And for us, Christ is the king. And so if we believe that, if God gives us free will, then we should respect free will in others. We should trust people on the whole to act freely. And we have to understand what freedom is, which is a whole different debate. But with Illich, there is a sort of paradox there, which is always affecting his discussion, especially when you get more directly into the criticism of the church, in that I think it's fair for when you do so and criticize the functions of the church as a human institution, but the one institution which really is capable of acting as God is the mystical body of Christ. And so in some respects, this institution does have kingship, does have authority, and has the right to centrally impose. It's not that there shouldn't be any imposition. It's a question of who's doing it and who's doing it well. And there's always going to be this tension within the church, and Illich is pointing this out. It's that we know it's there now. I mean, we're well aware of these tensions, but also any institution. He's not arguing, I don't think, for anarchy generally across his writing. Yeah. There are proper roles for some centralized authority, some centralized institutions, but the minute you create this yearning to worry about what people who are free and not as clever as I am to do it badly, and what will happen if all of that happens, is just a tension that exists within society and plays out all the way through. And Illich is articulating this in his time, the 70s and 80s, but it really applies today. I mean, I think this is in the political forum especially, and all the things connected to that, the economic forum, this is what we're seeing playing out today.
I couldn't agree more, David. And I was reading Illich, it just struck me as not only applicable today, but almost every time in history. It's the fundamental human fear of chaos. It's the fundamental human fear of a very, very complex society that we cannot control.
Right.
So what we see in society, what we see in any human society, even in the smaller society of the family, there is a fundamental element of unpredictability. And because there's unpredictability, there's an element of chaos in human behavior and in human interaction, out of which emerges a beautiful order. But there's a fear of the unpredictability and the chaos in human society. And out of that fear, there's this constant human temptation to impose a type of order that we can understand, or an order that comes from a centralized mind, like one controller, one planner that is going to impose on the whole a type of system of predictability and regularity. And this is one way of answering the problem of chaos. It's one way of doing it. And in certain situations, it actually works. In certain small situations, it works. In local communities, it tends to work very well because you have relationships of subsidiarity when the one in charge is very close to those who he governs. Yet in larger institutions, let's say like a whole nation, let's say like the people speaking the Spanish language, for example, in this book, the imposition of one standardized order might bring benefits, but then there's also a cost. There's a great cost that comes along with that. The cost is what is lost. And there's something beautiful in the order of the vernacular languages that was lost. There was a kind of a beauty in what Illich just simply called the vernacular element of society that was lost simply because they were all forced to adopt one standard. And this is why at first, when I was reading the essay, and upon my first read of the essay, I thought it was just kind of this rhetorical connection between Nebrija and the voyage of Christopher Columbus. I just thought it was kind of a rhetorical, these two things happened at about the same time in history, and there was kind of a rhetorical connection. The way that Christopher Columbus discovered a new world and began the colonization of the new world, so did Nebrija begin the colonization of the vernacular languages of the people in the Iberian Peninsula. He kind of started this colonization through a standardization of language. But I think that connection is more than rhetorical, because I think it's amazing. The same way that Christopher Columbus, in many ways, discovered a whole new hemisphere, even though he went to his death not realizing what he had discovered. So in a certain sense, did the MIchel, in this top-down imposition of a unified language, establish an unprecedented modern state which began to control the education and the thinking of its people through a medium of communication. And Illich does a very good job in the essay of bringing out how unprecedented that was. So in the same way that, in a sense, Columbus discovered a new hemisphere and ushered in the modern world, MIchel, in a sense, discovered a whole new hemisphere of political rule. The political rule through a mode of communication which is standardized, where not only can kings and queens and monarchs communicate in one standardized language, but then they can even, in a certain sense, begin to control the message. It was a whole new political hemisphere.
That's terrific, Father Brad. I totally agree with you. Some thoughts on what you just said. So Illich wrote further on language. In fact, he wrote a couple of books that are really dedicated to the question of language. One is called the ABC, the Alphabetization of the Popular Mind. And another one is called In the Vineyard of the Text. And I'm not sure in which one of his books, but he rails against the impoverishment of our modern expressions, where we use expressions in our everyday language that are spoon-fed. We regurgitate idioms that are completely stale and prefabricated by the media and so forth. And I realized it in my own language, as compared to when I was a child. At some point, I come from Lebanon. I was born in Lebanon. During the troubles in Lebanon in the 1970s, we moved to France, and in France, by some chance of circumstances, we ended up in a low-income neighborhood where there were lots of immigrants from. In fact, there were immigrants from Spain, because in 1970s Spain was a very poor country, and a lot of people came. Spanish people came to France to work in factories from Spain, from Portugal, from North Africa, Muslims and whatnot, my expressions, the language that I used was so much richer, at least in my recollection, spontaneous and funny and rich and whatnot. And all of this is lost, and now I can't really speak except in very stale sentences, as I do right, right now. And all of this has been lost. Yet there is, so that's one aspect. The other aspect is, so Illich, as you can probably imagine, was very instrumental in launching the homeschooling movement in the US. His first major book was called Deschooling Society, published in 1970 or 1971. And it had a tremendous impact, and a lot of the homeschooling movements, started. He played a role. He played a big role. Yet, what we teach our kids in home, we try to teach them. So now, homeschoolers, and that includes us. As a family of homeschooling family, part of the appeal is that we think that we can teach standardized language better than the public schools do, right? We're trying to right. We haven't gotten to the point that Illich is talking about. We still use the standard language as our standard, but we just claim that we can do it better than the public schools do.
I think I'm going to say the savior for you there, I suggest, is God's grace and personal freedom. Is that there's always hope through the faith and through the grace of God. The reason I say that is that as I'm listening to this, I've devoted a large part of my life really to trying to see the reemergence of a culture of beauty. And I've maintained, one of my sort of arguments that's developed over the years is that a culture of beauty emerges in the way that we've heard described from free action, where those individual actions or personal actions are governed by God's grace. And so you have to give people freedom. And the moment you try and institutionalize art, music, it might be an improvement over the disaster we have today, but it's actually not going to allow this beautiful pattern to emerge. But then it occurs to me that in the past, maybe the reason that they had a beautiful culture in the past wasn't because people weren't trying to institutionally impose central control. It's just that they couldn't. And whereas today they can, because of technology, and these institutions are developed, they're able to do it. And so maybe I ought to become a sort of radical anarchist or something who wants to destroy the whole society, except that I have faith, trust in God's grace, that there is one authority that I can look to, and that is God, who is present through the church, through in the sacraments. And so there is always hope, even in today's world, which is so given to sort of effective centralized control. That is the answer. And I would say in your family, again, we look to God, and that breathes air into the rigid environment, the enclosed environment that otherwise we create for ourselves.
I think that's beautiful, David. Now, the challenge for our world, we live in a thoroughly secularized society. In a thoroughly secularized society that does not have a God to look at, that does not have an ultimate mind that actually orders the universe freely and sweetly through the natures that he has created, we are going to enthrone something else in the place of God. And the modern superstition is to enthrone centralized bureaucratic institutions as that controlling governing force in society. And it is, I think it's a type of superstition where we believe that the only way that we're going to have in our godless world, the only way we're going to have order is if that order is imposed through some kind of a bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the natural result. That's the natural result of a truly secularized society.
Charlie, I don't know, do you have any thoughts based upon what you've heard at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question. There's so many different angles to approach. I mean, I came to that question mostly from the work of F.A. Hayek and kind of emergent order, both as an argument for a sort of classical liberalism, but also for rules. Not saying that we shouldn't have any rules, but that in an organically grown societal order, and Hayek hated the word society, so he would chastise me for even calling it a societal order. But that you have rules that evolve. Take just private property. That's a custom that pretty much evolves in every single society, at least with respect to certain things, like ownership of tools. That if you can call something yours and I can call something mine, then we can both focus on what we're best at and reap the benefits of trade or share the bounty of what we have. Whereas if we don't allow for that custom to exist, then we spend all of our time trying to protect what we think is mine. And so, it's definitely the existence of emergent order is not an argument against rules per se. It's just to say that we have to be very careful with how we meddle with them. And my favorite quote from Hayek, which I think that Illich would also sort of appreciate, is speaking of economics, that the curious task of economics is to illustrate to men how little they know about what they imagine they can design. But Illich is also very critical of classical economics, it seems. And even in this shadow work essay, he refers to Arthur Pigou, who was one of the early kind of, not so early, he was, I think, early 1900s. He's the idea of the Pigouvian tax, which is where you tax a negative externality, and that makes it so that you get less pollution or whatever it might be. But Pigou also defined the term shadow work, came up with this idea of shadow work or the shadow price, not shadow work, the shadow price referring to how much you would have to compensate someone for something that they're not doing in a market, like let's say a woman who stays home and tends to the house while her husband goes off and does wage labor. That idea of, what would you have to pay a woman to do that work? Can you assign like a shadow price to it? Illich seems to be very much against this idea because it intrudes on the domain of the vernacular. It intrudes on this whole sector that economists had to define as the informal economy, but which previously it wasn't the informal economy. It was just stuff people did or something like that. But I'd like to hear what MIchel has to say about that kind of denigration of classical economics. I don't know that it's all entirely deserved, but I do think that a lot of the econ profession, they're trying to measure things, and sometimes in order to measure something, they have to strip away some of the kind of the humanity of it.
Right. I think you're correct, Charlie, that he is critical of classical economists. I don't know to what extent he understands maybe the nuances between the different strands within the neoclassical economists. But I think, and that, it's something that he touches on in the next chapter. So, if we do, if we pursue this conversation about the next chapter, he starts to develop, to expand the scope beyond language, which is the focus of this chapter, into the economy. And so we'll have to examine Illich's thoughts maybe a little more critically, because there are some benefits to institutions in terms of, right? I mean, scaling things and making things accessible to a lot of people, making good material things accessible to a lot of people. And Illich tends to, poo-poo these ideas, that may be more, too utilitarian for him. So, I don't want to. I think it'd be good to talk about Illich's view and contrast it to modern economics thinking if we talk about that chapter, because that's where I think there's a weakness in taking the Illich position too far. At the same time, Illich just had me reconsider these things anyways, because at the end of the day, you never know what kind of society you're going to get, right? I mean, we're used to the material comforts that economies of scales and institutions have provided us. Are we happier for them, or I mean, these remain open questions. And so,
yeah, there's another aspect to Illich's thinking that occurred to me as I read this, and also other things about him. And it's approaching the same problem in a slightly different way, it seems to me. And that is that again, through the problem of institutionalizing things. And I've been involved in various groups and societies where, in order to facilitate, try to help people to do things properly, they institute standardized processes. What then happens is that curtails the freedom, because the people become attached to that standardized process as the only way to do it. So rather than viewing it as something that aids people if they don't know what to do, it actually becomes a limitation. It cuts out all creativity. And this is one of the dangers of institutions, of authorities and governments, so that the natural tendency is very often that even if that's the body which the institution which created those standards doesn't actually have any authority over people, they treat it as though it does. That people are looking to the you're not doing it the way you should. And people become suspicious of those who deviate from it, rather than looking on it as an offering to those people who are acting freely. And I've seen this in companies and office settings as well, that what become, the consultants come in, they standardize things, and in many ways it's helpful, but actually in the process, they cut out creativity and originality and stifle actually the life force in many ways of what created the company in the process. And again, the only hope there, that's an inevitable tension, I think, because I'm not arguing against standardization. As you say, in many ways it is helpful, it is useful, but we have to be aware of the negative impacts of these sort of processes. And I think Illich is, my sense of him, I'd be interested to see what you say about this, is that he's too critical and doesn't acknowledge the benefits as well. And there is this tension with institutions. Would you say that's fair?
I think that's correct. And I think maybe that perhaps that'll be more apparent in the next chapter.
Okay.
If we discuss it. Because in the next chapter, he will talk about what he calls the war on subsistence. That's the title of the chapter. And he tries to harken back to a mode of living, subsistence living, that has been lost. And we can argue that maybe he's romanticizing a past that wasn't there, or was he forgets the brutality of the kind of life that may have existed in the past. But maybe not. Again, I mean, I think there's enough in what he says to catch our attention and to cause us to pause a little bit and rethink these benefits. So maybe we'll leave it at that, because I think I don't want to open the door to another conversation.
I'm certainly interested in continuing this. I think this has been very, very interesting. So we'll close there. Any last words from the others, Charlie or Father, at all? Or should we just finish there?
Yeah, we can just finish there.
Okay. Okay. Well, until next time, thanks for listening, everybody. Charlie, Michel, and Father Brad, thanks for coming along. And we're glad you finally got the boat sorted out, Charlie. And were able to join us. Ah, there we go. There's the ship's bell. Okay. So until next time, goodbye and have a good week.